There are really three things that always drove me crazy about my mother. First, when she would call me on the phone, she would always start by saying, "James, this is your mother," which is helpful. I recognize that she wasn't so much identifying herself as establishing her authority immediately within the conversation. Second, she would skip to the end of the book after only reading 2 chapters. Read the ending, and then go back and read the rest of the book. And I'd say to Mom, if authors wanted you to read the book that way, they would have put the ending in the 3rd chapter. And she'd say, "I understand the story, Betty, and I know where it's going." Third, during an argument, she would also appeal to authority by quoting herself. She might say something like, "I always say cities should understand how much lead is in their drinking water." Or she might say something like, "I always say Coach Osborne made the right call when he went for 2 against Miami." Who quotes themselves? Especially with such conviction. And why the "I always say"? Because what followed the "I always say" was something that I had never, ever heard her say. Except for the 2-point conversion in the '84 Orange Bowl, we heard her say that a lot. She was always a big proponent of Coach Osborne, even when not everyone was. So these habits annoyed me, and perhaps they annoyed me more than they should. Because at important times in my life, she had good advice. And there were other times where her advice spoke louder than her words. There are 2 moments in particular that are forever linked for me. When I was in high school, a friend and I sang a difficult duet at a community concert, and it did not go well. It was terrible. And we knew it was terrible because a couple of our friends met us in the hallway, doubled over with laughter, saying, "That was awesome." So when I went home that night, what I expected to hear my parents say was, "Don't worry about it. It wasn't that bad." Nope. When I walked into our kitchen that evening, my parents mocked and made fun of our performance. Now, my mother and father like to laugh. And they're teasing us, and they're teasing each other, are some of my fondest memories of the 2 of them together. But coming after the laughter of my friends, it seemed a little brutal. So I told them it hurt. And this is when my mother became very serious, and she said to me, "Look, don't get bruised feelings. You know this wasn't your best. We wouldn't laugh if this was the best you could do. And in life, you're going to have failures. Learn to laugh at yourself, or you're going to be lonely." And 3, just telling you that you're wonderful all the time doesn't help you. You're going to get a big head, and you'll never know how to take the compliments that you deserve. That advice felt worse than the teasing. But what I thought was that maybe with a little reverse psychology, she might still come around and give me a bit of a compliment. So I said, "Rick and I did sound pretty bad, didn't we?" And she didn't miss a beat. She said, "Oh, honey, Rick stopped singing." It was what came out of your mouth that sounded horrible. Later, when I was in college, our opinions on some things began to diverge. We debated a lot. And I don't think that she actually had disagreed with my positions so much as with my activism. For instance, she didn't think I should be bringing it to church. But I wanted to speak on one issue from the pulpit. And it's an understatement to say that my mother was not enthusiastic about this idea. So on that Sunday morning, when my minister invited me up to the pulpit to say a few words, I heard two words from the other end of the pew. "Oh, James." And that's when I knew she was disgusted. And as I walked to the pulpit, I felt bad. This really was her church. She and Dad were there every Sunday, often late, but they were there. And maybe some of the congregation would share my views, but certainly nobody thought church was the place to discuss it. And yet there I was, on my way up, and I had to speak. But in that moment, I decided that I was going to respect my mother's opinion and those of the others in the congregation. And I decided that I wouldn't speak with deference, but I would speak with respect and hopefully some reverence. Still, during that whole time, I could not look at my mother. And the entire congregation sat in this expressionless silence. But what else could I expect? We were Methodists. Still, not a word was said to me on the way out of the sanctuary that day, and I assumed it was the congregation-wide anger and disappointment. Looking back, I realized many people were probably just confused, thinking, "What the hell just happened?" My parents left. They didn't stick around to visit after church, and I thought about driving back to campus and picking up my laundry another time. But I went home to face my mother. And when I walked into the kitchen, she put down her dish towel and she started in. And she said, "I have just one thing to say to you. I am so proud of you." During her cancer, my mother kept asking the oncologist what to expect. And like her books, she wanted to know how it was going to end. And maybe she's right. Maybe we understand our stories better when we know where they're going. Her last 3 weeks on hospice were both difficult and a blessing, and we had time to say things, but it's never enough. And there's also this pressure to make every conversation meaningful. The thing is, chemotherapy had destroyed my mother's hearing. So for a lot of the visitors that were passing by in the hallway, our touching, tender moments probably sounded a lot like us yelling at each other. But one evening, my mother said, "I was blessed to have children who aren't afraid to speak up." And I'd been thinking about these two moments for a while, and so I tried to say, it's because of you. We, as kids, learn to speak up because of you. But I choked up on the words, and they just squeaked out, and she looked at me and said, "What?" So I tried to compose myself and shouted into her ear, "We learn to speak up because of you." But that's all I could manage. And she smiled and she patted my arm. And maybe she thought I was teasing her about her hearing. But I think she understood. My mother didn't care for false praise or false modesty. She had strong opinions and a wicked sense of humor. But when she disagreed with us, she respected us, she was proud of us, and she loved us. And I learned something important from my mother. It may not be something you always say, but when it matters, you say it and you mean it.